Going live in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It is a pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Responsible Leadership and Climate Change. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Alex Mejia for the welcoming remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. Dear colleagues and dear participants, it is my great pleasure to be able to give you some welcome remarks for this very unique webinar. I would like to begin by thanking the Institute for Responsible Leadership out of London, Ms. Julie Search Whitaker. It's Outmost an excellent executive director, and also Professor Mike Sachs, our good friend at the United Nations at UNITAR. The same comment goes for all the speakers. We have an impressive array of panelists today that you are going to hear very soon. But just two ideas on behalf of UNITAR and the United Nations. The first one is that indeed climate change has been hotly debated for years now. It's a generational issue, and it's something that many people will have passion for, either pro or con. And I wanted to mention that because what we want to recognize, and remember this is a United Nations sponsored event with the ILL, we need to remember that science is science. Facts are facts, and that our personal opinions are always important, but we are entitled indeed to our opinions, but not to our own facts. So I say in the most respectful manner that it is about time, especially after this pandemic, that we acknowledge and recognize that climate change is indeed creating havoc and is damaging the most vulnerable of them all. If you think of populations in developing nations that live under the poverty line, in areas affected by drought, by excess of rain perhaps, or even in areas that are coastal communities, it's a different reality. You know, when we live in cities, I am in Geneva, Switzerland, several of our panelists are in the United Kingdom and in other urban areas, the reality is different. But here we must remember that climate change is a different and very harsh reality for the most vulnerable, for the poorest of the poor. And in giving you this idea, I wanted to also remember the importance of responsible leadership. We have to go beyond the need for sound leadership, political leadership, academic leadership, leadership in media, leadership in the private sector, and understand that there is a common factor when it comes to leadership, which is called integrity. And in that sense, I wanted to start this conversation perhaps in welcoming you all to highlighting the work of the IRL, the Institute for Responsible Leadership. The reason why we have a sponsor and supported the IRL for several years now is because we believe in the need to dwell and understand better what actually is responsible leadership. So today you are going to hear some experts talking about responsible leadership and climate change, but the central idea remains the same. We at the United Nations invite you to think about what responsible leadership actually is, why we need people in leadership in position of integrity based on their principles and not in political agendas or in the convenience of the bottom line sometimes when you look at budgets. In this case, climate change is something that will be highlighted at the highest level in Glasgow very soon. We are all at the United Nations making preparations for the COP, the Conference of the Parties, that will take place in November. And in that sense, this is very auspicious. The moment is correct to have this conversation. And again, on behalf of UNITAR and with our sincere congratulations to the Institute for Responsible Leadership, let me finish by giving you the best auspices for success ahead in these deliberations. Thank you so much, Julia. Back to you.
Thank you so very much, dear Alex. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator, Ms. Julie Search Whitaker. She's an educationalist and coordinator of community storytelling projects, convener for the Institute for Responsible Leadership in England. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you. And it's an excellent opportunity really to discuss what is absolutely pressing at the moment in our whole world. And rarely do we have a situation where the whole world is facing the same thing and, you know, we're all on the same page with that. I would like to start really by saying, you know, the obvious. I'm not going to give many facts and figures because that's for our expert panelists to do. But, you know, our planet is warming. The pressure to, you know, preserve a livable climate, our greenhouse gases must be reduced. And this is where all the action and all the planning and all of the important work that every single one of us must do starts. So just a little bit of a fact, in 2017, you know, the planet was warming by an average of 1 degree Celsius above the you know, industrial times. Now we are projected for that to increase 2 or 3 Celsius more every decade. And we are going, you know, it will be a global catastrophe unless action is taken. So lots of things are happening on the ground. So we have, you know, in it from an educational point of view, we have the issues are raised in schools, the issues are raised in industries. We look at our food, we look at our fuel, we look at our, you know, how green our agenda can be, and those conversations are about and around us. But we know that, you know, Greta Thunberg has been the kind of voice of the younger generation and has really kind of challenged some of the more established leaders into action, into having this conversation. But what I found very intriguing was just, I think the day before yesterday, I heard that this conversation about global warming has gone way beyond the scientists and way beyond the political boardrooms and the decision maker, but it's actually got into the soap operas. In England, we have very popular soap operas, which are all about, you know, popular culture. And there's actually a storyline with 5 soap operas in November about climate change. It's unprecedented. And these are about conflicting and competing companies who are working together to get those messages out to masses of people in a way that is easily communicated. So that's really quite something. So, you know, we now have a situation where we've got our summit in Glasgow in 2021. It's a huge responsibility for all of those who are going to be there. These, you know, were established by the UN and the Earth Summit in '92. With the Conference of the Parties, and they bring together almost every country in the world to tackle these issues related to climate change. It'd be hugely, hugely important summit. And as Alex has said, this is absolutely the time to be having this webinar and this conversation. This really may be the last chance to get climate change under control, and responsible leadership is key to enabling that to happen. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first expert panelist, David Zakas. David is an expert in international and global health. He has extensive knowledge and experience in academia and has been involved in many research and different collaborations. He writes and publishes a series of development and travel books, is currently contributing to the UN IRL book, which we are all aware of. He edits and publishes the Planetary Health Weekly, which is a weekly newsletter informing on global health and ecological issues, and co-leads a consultancy company on global education and research development, and will actually be attending the summit in Glasgow. So an expert person to be here today to be our keynote speaker. So welcome, David.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if you can see me.
Yes.
But thank you very, very much for the introduction. And thank you very much also, Dr. Alex Mejia, for your comments on science is science. Yes, it's really an amazing time and era to be alive, wherein we have the benefit of one of the greatest achievements of humankind ever, all of our scientific knowledge. And yet we're quickly running to a precipice, both with climate crisis and with the pandemic even. We are not using what we have been working towards and gaining over all these years. And so that brings up the whole idea of leadership. So I just want to again thank the UNITAR, the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, and the Institute for Responsible Leadership to invite me, for inviting me here today. And so what I'm going to be doing and what I've been asked to do is to provide a kind of an overview and a broad global picture of what's going on. I'm not going to get into too many details of facts and that, but I am going to take you through the science and then to the leadership, because we have the science and now we need the leadership. So that's just an overview of my presentation. So what is climate change? Just very easily defined, it's the repeated and increasingly unusual changes to our usual and historic climate and weather patterns. We all know what it is, really. We're experiencing it, probably every single one of us, many times during the year. And it's been going on a really truly observable scale for the last 50, 60 years, but especially in the last 20 years, and now particularly even in the last 5 years, we're being hit over the head with climate change to the degree now that we are in what we can call a climate crisis. So personally, I try to even avoid using the word climate change and just use the word climate crisis, because that is truly the descriptive and the narrative that needs to be promulgated and talked about. So the crisis, though, is the confluence of so many highly damaging related climate events in the recent years, affecting all parts of the world. And there's been huge destruction accompanied with huge economic losses. For example, just 2 months ago, the Hurricane Ida that hit in the United States, the tally of the destruction could even top now $95 billion just from one hurricane. So next slide. So how is climate change caused? Now, I'm just going to do this very, very briefly because it is so simple. Sometimes when we talk about the scientific issues, we think that they're so complex that it's not understandable and it's not easily comprehended by people without such scientific training. But this is not the case, because we all observe the light coming from the sun, which is the source of every bit of our energy on Earth. The sun shines down on us with visible light. This happens to be what we can measure, an electromagnetic radiation. We call it shortwave radiation. It includes all the different colors of light, as well as ultraviolet radiation. So this high energy shortwave radiation is emitted by the sun. It arrives on our Earth as visible light and ultraviolet light, which we don't see. Some animals see it, and we have tools that we can see that. And it's either absorbed as radiant heat, makes us feel warm when we stand in the sunshine and receive it on our face and on our skin. And it also heats the Earth in the same way. But a lot of that energy is changed. As it hits the Earth, it is then reflected back out into the atmosphere as long wave radiation. I don't understand the physics of how that happens, but it's been proven and it's been talked about for many, many decades, even 100 years, about the reflective properties of the Earth. And it sends back out changed shortwave radiation, now become long wave radiation, infrared. And then it is, oh, sorry. The radiation is then reflected back out into space, where it comes into contact with various gases in our atmosphere. And if those gases happen to be carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases, as we call them, nitrous oxide or methane, particularly, those three, but mostly carbon dioxide because of its huge imbalance in quantity, it absorbs and re-emits the long wave radiation as heat. And this has been discussed and studied by scientists for almost 150 years now. So this is not something that we're just making up in the last few years to try to explain climate change. This is the way it happens. This is the physical nature of our Earth and the physics of it. And so the more carbon dioxide there is in the atmosphere, next slide, the more heating there will be and the more greenhouse gases. So this is a very simple chart showing the radiation coming in. Some of it's absorbed by even the clouds as it comes, but some it's absorbed by the Earth and then re-emitted back out. And then the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases emits heat from coming into contact with the radiation, the reflected radiation of the sun. So that's it. Next, that's it. It's so simple and yet it's so debated. And here is a very long-term picture over the last 1,000 years about carbon dioxide concentration in our atmosphere. And we can see where we're at now in the year 2000 and 2020. We are going off the chart. We've now, next slide, please. We can see here, right up to date, that we're at way above pre-industrial carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas levels into our atmosphere, and particularly in these last several decades. It is just continually increasing. And we can see here carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And the bottom charts are the level of growth per year. So it's not just that it's being emitted, but it's actually increasingly being emitted year after year after year. Even during the pandemic, there have been increases of greenhouse gases, even though they slowed down, but the decrease did not start. Next. So there's no question about it. Carbon dioxide long wave radiation absorption is an established fact. This carbon dioxide atmospheric content has reached an unprecedented level, almost a 50% increase over pre-industrial levels. That means we are polluting our little thin layer that encompasses our globe with 50% more carbon dioxide and much more too of the other major greenhouse gases. Of course, there's seasonal variations of temperature, but these have changed as well. There's more extreme events and there's ocean warming. There's a lot of other things I'll just briefly introduce coming soon. And even in what's particularly interesting, because I'm speaking from Canada, about 200 kilometers north of Toronto. Our northern latitudes in our country are changing at 2 to 3 times the rate of the rest of the world, and the same with Russian Siberia. Next, please. So the major effects of the warming atmosphere and our continually higher levels of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases includes the increase of our global average temperatures of Earth, and with an uneven distribution throughout the world. But now, as Julie mentioned, we are now 1.2 degrees warmer than pre-industrial levels, and we're well on our way to being 1.5 degrees warmer, which is our cutoff level. And there's just a new report came out a few weeks ago that we now have a 40% chance of any year in the next 3-4 years of being 1.5% warmer. So it's going to happen, and it's going to happen soon, for sure, by the end of the decade. There's no question about that. The oceans are warming because of this. The atmosphere is warming. The oceans also warm because the oceans comprise 70% or so of our Earth. And when oceans warm, when you heat water, it expands. Even if it's just a tiny little bit, the expansion becomes very significant because of the size of the ocean, and especially in the top 700 meters of the ocean. The very bottom depths of the ocean aren't much affected, but it's the top layer. The ocean is divided into 3 layers for study. And it also acidifies because the ocean is a huge sink for carbon dioxide. It absorbs at least 30% of the emitted carbon dioxide every year. It is changing its acidic properties, and it is becoming a higher pH and more acidic, lower pH. So there's also been startling Arctic sea ice decline and glacial retreats all over the world. And everybody is able to witness that. And in the increasing and frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. This, I think, is what we're all much more tuned into with hurricanes, typhoons, cyclones. They're all called something different depending which ocean that they're raging on. The rain flooding that caught Germany and the Benelux countries a short while ago, and droughts all over the world, heat waves, including in my country, and tremendous wildfires resulting from the droughts and generally people not paying attention about what they're doing, setting fires. And recent changes in the climate system are unprecedented over the last hundreds of years and even many thousands of years. We're living in a very unique age. We can see here some fires, some dried out farmland, and a raging hurricane in off the coast of Florida. Next. And the ice, literally thousands and thousands of cubic kilometers thawing every year over and above the formation of ice. We are losing so much of the world's kind of absorptive capacity to control itself. It has all these mechanisms for keeping the temperature within a very certain range, and that includes all the ice on the north and the south poles and on the tops of the mountains and other things. So next. So the more major effects are a huge effect on biodiversity, and I know that this will be a subject next speaker, but there has been a huge decline of all animals except humans. Our population increases by a net of 220,000 people every single day, but not so for birds, mammals, fish, and amphibians and reptiles whose populations are being decimated. Agriculture and fisheries are disrupted on a very huge scale by climate change. Perhaps this being one of the most important issues to look at and to study because it affects the feeding of our 7.7 billion people now, and growing by 220,000 every single day. And various diseases are now able to spread much more easily because of the warming climate. Many diseases are spread by vectors like mosquitoes, like the Zika virus, and ticks spreading Lyme disease, and other types of invasive species taking over new environments as they warm. And so there's also many other effects on humans, including heat, stress, malnutrition. Mental illness is an area that has been just beginning to be looked at and is a huge important factor in climate change. The rise of mental illness directly related to all of these disasters. People are getting post-traumatic stress disorder from the fires, from the floods, from the very thing that our warming atmosphere is causing, and including loss of employment, forced migration, and hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of already climate refugees. And this is an area too that is only going to get worse. So records are continually being set almost daily, it feels like, but it's more like monthly and yearly, but record upon record are continually being broken, and there are truly monumental changes taking place on Earth. Next. 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 One of the things that I like to talk about with my students, because it's such an interesting area, is about the coral bleaching. And not only are the oceans warming and expanding and affecting coastal cities by the rising and the increased tides and wave structures coming in on the cities and on some small nation states, but the corals are also being affected all over the world. In fact, I can't remember right now exactly, but it's something like 50% of the corals around the world have been killed by climate change. And it is so simple to understand, because we all know that we love corals, and maybe many of you have swum and skin dived and viewed corals and all the fish and marine life that takes place around them. But the coral itself is a white structure, and it is inhabited by a very tiny microplankton called a zooxanthelle. And these are what cause all the color. These microorganisms have all the colors of the coral. But when the waters that the corals are living in get warmer than the interval of spread of temperature that the corals can live in, when it sustains higher than the temperature that they start to die, then what happens is, because of the heat, all the little microorganisms leave. They leave the coral structure, and that's what we call bleaching. So it leaves the coral and it turns it white. And if these little microorganisms do not return to the coral and restore itself, the coral within about a year or so will die itself, because the coral lives in a symbiotic relationship with these little microorganisms. The microorganisms have a place to live and prosper and feed by living inside the coral, and the coral uses the microorganisms for its food. So next, anyway, it's just a little side. So what can be done? I mean, the main thing that can be done and has to be done is that greenhouse gas emissions have to be reduced. There's just no question about that. Some people say, well, technology might help us in the future, or we're going to remove the carbon dioxide from the air with big machines. Well, that is just so far way into the future. We have to ourselves lower our emissions, and by changing our production modes of production and how we obtain our energy from fossil fuels to more green technologies like solar, wind, biogas, hydrogen fuel. And we need lots and lots more of research and development on this. We can mitigate the effects of the climate change. We can try to use our current technologies and our current knowledge by developing these new technologies, by developing new modes, and by changing our habits, by changing the way we live, to consume less fossil fuel and to emit less fossil fuel. And I'm sorry to say this comes from a Canadian whereby on average, we're the biggest polluters in the world, unfortunately, our country. Then the third is adaptation. We have to adapt to the effects that are already taking place. The floods, the fires, the heat stress, the heat waves, the strokes. We have to train our health systems. We have to change our infrastructures in our cities. I think I've read that Miami City spends about $400 million a year on adaptive measures every year after year. Many places along the east coast of the United States are actually raising their roads up so that they can miss out when they have storm surges. Of course, we need lots and lots of education. This is so important. And as an educator myself, at the post-secondary level, I also think, though, that where we really need to have strong education focus is in the primary and the secondary grades. We need to reach our upcoming generations, because it is they that are going to be living with the brunt and all the effects of what we're doing now more than we are, and they have to be prepared and also inspired. And lastly, all of us have a role to play, and many others, in providing direction and leadership and inspiration to other people to foment and to promote some of these changes that are needed, to realign our priorities and goals, and not to settle for anything less than action. Action, action, action. We have to be doing, not just talking and setting policy, but we have to act. So we have to look to the future. We have to envision the future. This is the beginning of what I'm going to say about leadership, about envisioning the future and then directing and helping to pave the way so that we can have a great future in the future. And you know, so often we're caught in time zones for re-election, for election campaigns, for changing leadership or renewing leadership. But we have to think in the long term. And I had a mentor many years ago who taught me to try to think about a 10-year time span. That was Dr. John Evans, the former president of University of Toronto. Next. So what is leadership? What is responsible leadership? And leadership provides direction, either to success or out of failure. In this case, it seems we're encroaching failure. And so we're going to need leadership just to get us back into an even keel and then looking to the future and acting when you know you must. This is what real leaders do. They act when they realize that they have to take an action. They have to do something. And we see leadership rising in all areas of the world now. People taking action, taking decisions to solve problems, prioritizing the most urgent, knowing when to step up or step down, use of power carefully. Leadership means the exercise of power. And that's a whole nother presentation, but to making rules and policy and driving through major change, to getting the consensus necessary for major change, and to counter misinformation. We live in a world now where we're being bombarded with just way too much misinformation, and it's getting way out of control now. Leaders need to be evidence-based, but also use their intuition, also use their experience and their training and their what they feel in their body too about what needs to be done, and to put their followers over their own personal interests and keeping commitments, not just posturing or what we call now with the climate crisis, greenwashing, reliance on rhetoric, and we have to build on integrity. Next. One of my favorite areas of leadership is the use of a tool that I've taught everywhere I've worked, basically, particularly with NGOs though, but is a focus on organization culture. And this is something I learned quite a long time ago, early on in my PhD studies, many, many years ago, about how we have to use and we can use this concept of organization culture to promote change, to encourage change, and to enact change. And we look at the values of society. We look at our rites and ceremonies, the things that we do. We're now a culture of webinars, and the symbols that we have, and the myths and the stories that circulate in our society, and our heroes, and our cultural and communication networks. We have to use and understand all of these issues in order to try to create change and promote change in the future. Next. So upcoming summits, and there've been lots of summits already, and I truly do like this one. And so what if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? Anyway, next. So sources of leadership. Now, leadership can spring up in just about every corner of society. And so this is just a conceptual framework, if you will, of where leadership is, but it exists everywhere. And it's at the global, the multilateral level. And there's even not only just people, but there's even documents. And Julie mentioned the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change from 1992. That document in itself is giving leadership and provides leadership. These types of supra policies, and now we have the Sustainable Development Goals. But we also look to governments for leadership. Perhaps that's we're looking and expecting too much of governments because of the way that government works in most of our societies. They're not seemingly able to achieve as much as we need. There's the private sector, the business sector, philanthropy. These are all sources of huge leadership in our world. And as far as I can see, and from my monitoring through publishing the Planetary Health Weekly, a lot of the innovation and real moving forward is coming from the business sector. And civil society also. Civil society is playing a huge role in the climate crisis. Many NGOs, and now we even have a new term about environmental justice leaders, that people are rising out of civil society to lead us and to provide us some motivation and into a proper future. Education and research sectors, so important. All of our schools, the primary schools, secondary schools, the universities, the colleges, and all of the research that's associated with that and elsewhere. And it's so interesting that Julie mentioned about the soap operas, because The sports, entertainment, and the arts are a huge area of leadership. This is where perhaps most of the leadership in our world comes from. I'm not sure, but I do know that when a very famous basketball player says something, or a very famous soccer player, Ronaldo or somebody says something, people listen and they get press and they can be a huge influencer. Religious organizations. We have lots of faith-based organizations trying to lead the change for a better future and reducing the climate crisis. The military, that is so interesting to know that most of the sophisticated militaries of the world have targeted climate change as a huge risk area for them. If for nothing else than the establishment of their bases. So many bases I was reading the other day of the American military are based in the East Coast. And now with the hurricanes, extreme hurricanes and flooding, they're suffering billions of dollars of damage on their military bases, just as a small example of what. And indigenous peoples, the people who've been on the earth since time immemorial and have been living in harmony with the earth just to survive all the ice ages and the extreme events that took place in the past. We need to listen to these people for their wisdom and their knowledge and their understanding and relationship that they have with the earth. It's something that I have really grown to learn about in the last several years. And it's truly remarkable to learn what they know about Earth and our youth. Our youth are our future. Sounds silly, but it's absolutely true. They're the ones who are going to have to live with it. And so even within these groups, we can have even subgroups. There are many women's organizations in civil society. There are many racialized groups, Black Lives Matter, that have a climate change perspective, etc. So there are so many areas where leadership is coming from and where it can come from and needs to be strengthened. And it's at all these different levels, right down to the family, which is the basic organizational unit of all our societies on Earth, and the individual. Next. And mentioning a youth and an individual, I just had to, and I just saw this a couple days ago on Twitter. Greta Thunberg was sending a message to the Brazilian Senate about trying to preserve and maintain the Amazon, the lungs of the earth. But she's the first one to come out and say that we have failed. The leaders of the North, the global North, we have really totally failed. We have not done our job. Our leadership has not. Next. Here's kind of what we're looking at. We cut down the whole forest and we plant one tree. We pollute so much and we take out a tiny bit. Next. Here's a modeling of carbon behavior. And we can see where most of the carbon dioxide is being emitted and who's responsible for climate crisis. It's no coincidence that the blue is all over Northern Europe, North America, and us. Next. So we think that we live in a paradigm where economic growth is primordial, where it is the most important thing in our societies, and this is something that's going to have to change. We're drowning in our own wealth. Next. So there's been a few key global leadership events, and I will quickly finish up my presentation. Beginning right back, it can go back many years, but I always like to start with the 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, giving people the right to health, to education, to life on Earth. And in 1979, there was a publication of the Limits to Growth from the Club of Rome, warning the world. And we all thought, oh, isn't that interesting? Yeah, we didn't really believe it then, but now we do. 1988 was the formation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This was the world's response to needing an advisory body with all of its top climate scientists and even other scientists, anthropologists, sociologists, economists. And then in 1992, 4 years later, the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development at Rio de Janeiro, it produced, as Julie mentioned, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which became our global policy for leading us forward. It now has pretty well the whole world joined on, 197 signatories, or parties as they are called. And this then resulted in the first conference of parties, the people who signed on, not people, but countries that signed on to the UNFCCC in 1995 in Berlin. And then in 2012, another monumental conference, which was the Rio Plus 20 years later, which gave us the Sustainable Development Goals, taking over from the Millennium Development Goals. These are global policies that are to, again, lead us into a healthier world, a world of wellness for all. And next. Now, there are many documents that can be cited. The other landmark event was the 2015 COP21 Paris Agreement. Of course, the meeting took place in Paris. It came out agreement. And this was supposed to be a legally binding agreement by those who signed it to keep the world's global average temperature below or not exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius. And for sure, not 2 degrees Celsius, which would be catastrophic. We're likely, though, headed towards 2 degrees C by the end of the decade, regardless now. We'll wait and see. So it was also mentioned about COP26 in Glasgow, starting at the end of the month, beginning of next month. And there's also going on right now in Kunming, China, a biodiversity conference, which will have its second part next year. These are two very, very important conferences for the global picture right now. Next. So we scientists, we use data and charts and everything, and politicians, well, they use polls and what they think will maybe earn their re-election campaign some funds or whatever. Next. But take a look at this. I've just found this on Twitter just a few days ago. This is a published graph showing the increase of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere. But the person whoever did it posted it and put on each one of the COP meetings. So as we in the world come together to try to solve climate crisis and deal with it, it just gets worse and worse and worse every year after year after year after year. So the words of Greta Thunberg the other day, blah, 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 she said, couldn't ring more true. Next. So we have to keep our eye on this. This is where we live. This is all we've got. I don't know if you heard William Shatner yesterday, who spent 10 minutes or whatever in space yesterday, but he said it frightened him to death to see the darkness on one side of the space capsule and then see the Earth on the other. He said that caused him great fear because we have only one home and we're really not doing very well with it. So next, hopefully though, with all of this work that we're doing and bringing people together and all these meetings, we will see the Earth rising. Hopefully this is what is in our future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. Sorry, I was hadn't unmuted.
Sorry for going a little over. Yeah.
So that was excellent and it's given us many things to think about, not all wonderful things to think about, but really comes with the same message that we've all got to do something. So now I would like to introduce Edward Milner. Edward is an expert on ecological issues and evolution. He's an independent consultant and a former BBC producer and member of the newly formed Sustainability Research Institute at the University of East London. So again, an excellent person to be part of this panel. And I know that Edward will talk through some of his slides and highlight the issues that we've been discussing. Thank you, Edward.
Thanks
very much. Thanks very much. Can you hear me?
Are you
Hello,
okay,
can you-
Edward? Yeah?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes?
You can hear me. Okay, fine. Can I have the first slide, please? I wanted to start by talking about our home, because where we live, the natural world, we should just reflect a little bit on what actually we have here. We've got a world which, without our influence, is self-regulating. We have rain, tides, a regular pattern of life in an oxygen-rich atmosphere, which is produced, next slide, please. Hello, next one, please. Which is produced an amazing biodiversity. This is the extraordinary diversity of all forms of life. And what worries me is that we haven't really valued this very well. We've disturbed it, and we're effectively using it up. Next slide, please. No? We've disturbed the balance of nature, and we're continuing to do so. This is what I call the human footprint, and it's getting to be too much. It's not just carbon in the atmosphere. The whole biosphere has suffered an unsustainable exploitation of resources and, next picture, please, widespread pollution. Hello? I mean, that sort of picture is appalling. And current trends are now very well understood. And they will, unless moderated, they'll render the surface of this planet uninhabitable, possibly within a single lifetime. In other words, curbing CO2 emissions isn't going to be sufficient. It's going to need more than switching from petrol-driven cars to electric vehicles or closing down coal-fired power stations. If we want a globe that we can live on satisfactorily, we're going to need to change. And unfortunately, human society at the moment operates as if there was no absolute limits on anything. On a finite planet, this is clearly nonsense. We need to stop and change our direction. Next one, please. Particularly, we don't value tropical forest. Tropical forests absorb energy. They use energy from the sun to cycle moisture, produce clouds, and create green material, which obviously is useful for animals, for food for animals. But they actually regulate the climate of the tropics. But unfortunately, what we've been doing is cutting down so much of the tropical forest that we've changed the climate in many places. And we're continuing to do that. There's so many products inside a tropical forest. The riches inside a tropical forest are incredible, diversity of animal and plant life. And most of the products that we get for foods, medicines, and construction materials, many of these things have come from tropical forest and will come in the future. And in particular, we're going to need a lot more genetic resources to improve crop plants and animals. And these resources, and also medicines, these genetic resources are away there in tropical forest. But what are we doing to tropical forests? This is what we're doing. Next one, please. We're transforming them for our own short-term benefit. This is for planting oil palm. We're removing thousands and thousands of species and replacing them with one. Now, this is not only that, we're drenching the palm oil plantations with chemicals, so we're disrupting the moisture cycle, and we're disrupting the entire environment. This is to support the modern lifestyle of vast economies, but we're spending the Earth's natural capital as if there was no tomorrow, and at this rate, the reckoning will be much sooner than we thought. Next slide, please. some of the effects are drastic. Look at this. Oh, sorry. That's what we're turning the tropical forest into. That's part of the Amazon, now soya fields. And you can see the dust rising. We'll come back to that later. That is changing the weather pattern of that part of the Amazon, and on a large enough scale, the weather pattern of the whole of the continent. Next one, please. The Aral Sea may not matter to most people, but it's a very good example of what can happen if you go too far. Too much water was taken out of the rivers that supply it to grow cotton, and the result was the Aral Sea was destroyed, all life extinguished. We can calculate the cost of a single ton of carbon, but can we calculate the cost of a hectare of rainforest? Next slide, please. And the extinction of a few hundred species, unseed myriad forms of life like ants that maintain the whole system. Now, taking all this into account, what might responsible leadership entail? Change has to come. Now, I'm not going to talk about new ideas and innovations, but there are three areas of what we're doing at the moment that I think we need to concentrate on, and we certainly need more responsible leadership. It's very urgently needed. Next one, please. That's the human footprint, another human footprint in the Amazon. I rather like that. It looks like the giant footprint of some yeti or something, or tropical yeti. But bear in mind that that is not only destroyed all the animals and plants in that area, but the chemical pollution goes downstream for tens or hundreds of miles. We've got the idea of peak coal, of restricting carbon emissions by reaching a peak. We need to reach a peak of deforestation and a peak of soya. What about a peak chicken? When are we going to reach the maximum production of chicken? Because at the moment, it's spoiling, damaging forests, removing forests on such a scale that there's not going to be much forest left at this rate. Now, one thing we need to do then is to concentrate on understanding what both the upstream and downstream costs of actual products are. All our commercial products have a footprint and have upstream costs and downstream effects. And these things need, sorry, one second, not yet. We need to be able to assess both the upstream costs. What does it cost to get into this situation of producing all these chickens? We've destroyed a lot of forest. Those are the sorts of costs. But downstream, the pollution that we produce, the emissions we produce, those costs need to be calculated as well. Next one, please. Now, the second area, interesting, is that there are people like Greta Thunberg and many others who've stood up against environmental destruction, and they've been murdered. They've been harassed. They've been corrupt politicians and businessmen have arrested them. And it's estimated that in 2020, over 200 environmental activists who are our conscience, let's face it, 200 environmental activists around the world were murdered. Now, this is appalling. Leadership is needed to stop this happening, and we need allies. Responsible leaders need to find allies to resist this tide of criminal activity. Now, I've got a third area. Next one, please. Decision making. Here's a selection of the most famous economists and political thinkers who've influenced our decision making. Notice anything about them? They all look a bit like me, or people like me. They're all elderly white males. And one of the key things we absolutely must do, and when I say we, I'm not talking of we as elderly white males, the world needs to bring other people into the decision-making process. The Greta Thunbergs of this world need to have more influence. the indigenous people in this world need to have more influence. They look after forests in ways that we haven't the faintest idea about. FAO has shown that forests under indigenous management are far more well conserved and enriched in ways that nobody else achieves. So the trends, imagine if these people were in charge and everything was going beautifully, you'd say, well, absolutely fine. But the problem that the decision-making by this lot has resulted in is trends which are going to kill us all. So the conventional wisdom has to be changed. We're going to need a new sort of economic theory to dominate, what's called well-being economics, or what the Resilience Institute calls ecological civilization. Now, these ideas aren't new. As David mentioned, the Club of Rome mentioned this 50 years ago. They looked at current trends and they said, look, life on the planet is going to become impossible in another 20 or 30 years at this rate. Now, we've got past that, I know, but those trends are getting more and more serious. Now, one final picture, which seems to me prophetic, is a sort of metaphor for the situation we're in. This is what happens when you turn large areas of the tropics from dense forest into large-scale agriculture. Ground temperatures rise intolerably, dust distributes, severe droughts result, and the folly of unrestrained private enterprise is revealed. This is a city in southern Brazil which is about to be overwhelmed by something it has never experienced before, a desert sandstorm, the sort you might see in Cairo. This is southern Brazil, a major agricultural area. This is the Aral Sea comes to Westminster. So I've got three, next slide, please. So finally, next picture, please. Three areas I want to, oh, sorry. Go back one, yeah. So those three areas that I think future leaders need to be very, very well aware of. Measuring planetary footprints. We can only correct things when we know what they are. Secondly, environmental crime is a far more significant and important problem than we realize. And thirdly, the process of decision-making has to be widened. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Edward. That's really another excellent presentation, and really a message to say how powerful images are, you know, with the words. You just have to look at those and you can feel nothing but despair in some cases, and know that we have to act. So thank you for that. I would now like to introduce Mwako Hosodo. Mwako is Vice President of CISA University and has been doing her sociological research by observing human relationships in the healthcare field. She's particularly interested in the coordination of people who are coping with health issues and healthcare policy and public participation. But recently, Mwako has been interested in the coexistence of humans and the natural environment, and so is an ideal expert to provide an overview, particularly from the perspective of Japan, of global warming. So welcome, Mwako.
Thank you very much for your introduction, Julie. So today I'd like to talk about condition of a sustainable coexistence between people and nature. Next slide, please. Human activities have become so broad and they are damaging the animals, plants, soil, and oceans on the planet. In order to remain sustainable in the future, we need to change the mindset to create a world where people and nature live together, and responsible leadership is tremendously important. Next slide, please. In such a situation, Japan's previous stance was to pursue only the country's economic development and faced many major environmental problems such as air and water pollution, since 1950s. Next, please. Minamata disease is a typical pollution disease caused by mercury in the wastewater discharged by factories in 1950s. The contaminated water pollution, the ocean, and wreaked serious damage to the people who ate the fish caught there. Although the effluent from the factories has stopped, many people are still suffering from Minamata disease. A film titled Minamata was produced in 2020 last year. The film depicts the world as seen by Eugene Smith, an American photographer who has been photographing people suffering from Minamata disease. Next, please. After a history of destroying the environment by prioritizing economic activities, Japan is beginning to respect the need to protect the natural environment and create a society where people and nature coexist in harmony. I'd like to introduce 3 cases for the coexistence between human and nature in Japan today. Next, please. Thank you. The first case is in the Sanriku Coast in Kesenuma, where fishery and oyster aquaculture have become the major industry. Before, due to water pollution, outbreak of the red tide sometimes occurred and damaged the oyster aquaculture. To purify the river that flew into the sea, fishermen planted trees in the mountain. As a result, the sea has been gradually cleaned. Now, the fishermen have become economically successful in oyster farming. Next slide, please. The second case is Toki bird in Sado Island. Toki bird is endangered species. It used to live in all over Japan. Toki bird usually eat frogs, small fish, and small animals in and near rice paddy field. However, usage of pesticide and chemical fertilizer have killed such creatures. The Japanese government has undertaken a project to artificially breed Toki and bird return to the nature. Farmers also tried to grow rice without using chemical fertilizer. As a result, frogs and insects have returned to the rice field. Toki birds can now live in the area. The rice production in those fields is sold at a good price as Toki rice, previous rice, but the farmers are very happy to sell the Toki rice. Next slide, please. The third case is solar sharing in Odawara in maybe you may know, in 2011, the Great East Japan earthquake caused an explosion at a nuclear power plant. So therefore, people are trying to stop nuclear power and promote renewable energy. One of them is solar sharing in Odawara City, where solar panels are installed on farmland. Solar power is being generated in rice field, and the electricity is being used to run a coffee shop and make sake from that rice. Next slide, please. So I have listed 3 examples of people and nature living in harmony, but there are many more such examples through Japan and the world. As David said, taking action is very important. So responsible leaders need to support and promote such social movement and activities. All on the planet connected and existing in harmony, and human beings are just a part of the cycle. As more people become aware of the natural ties, nature will become rich and flourish, so does people. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Moaka. That was absolutely fantastic to have some really specific examples of how we have to, if we're going to move forward, work with nature and coexist. And humans are otherwise very dangerous creatures, you know, can do a lot of damage. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
I would now like to introduce Professor Michael Hopkins. Michael is one of the co-founders of the Institute for Responsible Leadership. He is both an academic and a businessman, having published many books and holds a number of professorships. One of his widely known books is on sustainable corporate sustainable responsibility. And he also held a World Employment Conference with the topic, a basic needs approach to development planning, moving away from just the focus on economic growth and obviously absorbing and incorporating now what we understand has to be a much wider agenda if we are going to address some of the issues raised today. So therefore, this is very apt for our webinar today, which looks at global warming and how a wider agenda is necessary to address these urgent issues. So welcome, Michael. Hello, are you there?
Hey.
Excellent. Hello.
I run so many seminars, and I spend most of my time telling people to switch on their microphone.
I know.
In the case of Ed Milner, usually to switch it off. But hi, Ed.
Welcome.
Nice to be here with my friends. While preparing a few remarks for this this seminar, I rarely spoken on environmental issues, not because I don't think they're important, but I think so many other people have. So I've been working much more in the social, economic, and financial areas. I just want to make a few points today. It so happened that while preparing for this seminar, I met two of my friends, and one of who was rather famous for the idea of basic income, but he sent me a newspaper article by Robert Reich, the former Labour minister, I think under Bill Clinton. And he basically said that corporate social responsibility and related issues is just a bunch of BS. I won't say that in public, but you know what that means. And then he tried to justify that issue. It got me thinking, actually. And when I also met another friend of mine, actually, I have some rather strange friends, I must say, who used to run oil and gas conferences right across the world. And he ended up charging a fortune and made about 30 million pounds from all his lectures and so on. And he said to me, the same as Robert Reich, he said, you know, by the end of this century, oil and gas will still be there. He said, I'm speaking to the leaders every day, and they're rather two-faced about all this. So my first point is exactly that, is following on from my two, and they're still friends, even though we do disagree on most of these points. Somebody just walked in the door. Hi, sit down, Roger. A disbelief that CEOs will be responsible. Second, what Robert Reich said, that CSR is just a bunch of whatever. Third, that ExxonMobil portraying actually double faces in this area. And then I've been arguing in my more recent book, which will be out pretty soon, the need for a charter for companies to present views annually, which is the subject of that book. Next slide, please. That's my existing book, which gives a roadmap to dealing with a lot of these issues. Next slide, please. There's one thing that Robert Reich said. I'm not going to read the whole thing. You can get hold of these slides at some point with some of the details on them. But basically, his basic thesis is that CEOs won't do anything that hurts their bottom line, whatever they say. Next slide, please. He said, Robert Reich, that he's seen this repeatedly when he was Labour Secretary, that CEOs are in the business of making as much money as possible and not solving social or economic and environmental problems. We seem to have gone back with the slides. Next one, please. I'm used to pressing the buttons myself. Can we get the next slide? Yes, when he was Secretary of Labour, he said he saw this repeatedly, that big corporations would violate laws on worker safety, wages and hours, and all sorts of other issues. And whatever to do so was actually cheaper than obeying laws. He talked about the Business Roundtable, one of Washington's most prestigious corporate groups, who in fact are actually working against today Biden's big environmental expansion and laws to promote social and economic justice. Next slide, please. He documents this, and you can see the references in the slides. Since then, the Roundtable has issued a continuous stream of statements about their dedication to such things as providing childcare and so on. But it turns out that these are exactly the priorities that Joe Biden's 3.5 trillion bill will cover. But guess what? The Business Roundtable isn't actually lobbying for the bill. It's actually lobbying intensely against it. The hypocrisy knows no upper bounds. Next slide, please. I've already hit my 6 minutes. Are you going to kill me, UNITA? Let me just finish off. As I said, my friends in the business say that these problems will be with us right to the end of the century, and the oil companies will carry on as they are now. And there was a report in The Economist that despite wildfires and so on, energy firms such as ExxonMobil are planning to increase fossil fuel production. Next slide, please. And nearing the end. So on their website, they start arguing ExxonMobil about all the things they're doing for carbon capture, and they've got a big program to do this. So are they going to follow that route or not? Many years ago, you can look it up on the website. On my website, I wrote an article saying, love Shell, hate Exxon. Why? Well, you can read it there. Next slide, please. So most of the last 25 years I've been working on this issue, I've defined corporate social responsibility as treating key stakeholders responsibly. A stakeholder, of course, is the environment. You can look at that detail in the next slide, please. I argue in my latest book that there's a need for companies to do much more than they are on the big issues of the day, such as the environment we're talking about today. So I've argued the need for a charter for large companies under CSR sustainability to be involved in big issues and to produce such a report every year. One of the problems with too many reports is that they tend to be all over the place and rather long, and in the end, nobody reads them. So I'm arguing for only a 10-page report. Next slide, please. So what next? I identify 5 points where something could be done, board level discussions, governments asking for input for large companies. And we see under the OECD that this tax provision right across the world for companies, it's going to be quite interesting to see how that's going to develop and how that's going to be resisted. Next slide, please. I'm conscious of time and I'm just near the end of it. So big business is doing everything in its power to sabotage Biden's plan. And Paul Krugman in the New York Times wrote yesterday that, just to be clear, corporations aren't being good guys. They support vaccine mandates and so on, but they do everything they can to fight climate change issues because they just don't want to pay higher taxes. So we in this business have got to address some of these issues and get into the nuts and bolts of why companies are going down this road. Last slide, please. Oh, okay. We have a slide on the Institute of Responsible Leadership, which is actually trying to promote responsible leadership right across the world. And let's hope that seminars such as these will give our institute an extra fillip. And I'd like to thank Julie very much for being an excellent host and putting up with people like me and Edward Milner, who are not the easiest people to get along with, not as easy as Milwaukee, and that wonderful talk by David. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, thank you. And I was just, before we do anything more, I would just like to look at the next slide, and I'd like to thank Michael very much for your contribution, because working with people, the people that you do, you hear their views and you hear what is actually happening on the ground, and it's about, you know, what do we do about that? How do we influence that in a responsible way as part of our role? So just want to go through this slide very quickly to show you what we do. You know, the Institute of Responsible Leadership, you know, we promote leadership integrity. We offer courses and seminars, we publish, we do webinars, we work with the UN, we provide high quality input and facilitation. We have excellent fellows, and you know, we promote a charter on responsible leaderships for companies and organizations. So thank you, Julia. I'm happy with that slide. The information's on there, and at the end of this presentation, all of these things will be uploaded onto our website and will be sent to you as panelists and anybody who's contributing. I have a request now from Julia to ask everybody who is present to put their camera on for a photograph that will then be used for publicity. And I'd then like to please address some Q&As that have come through, and the first one will go to David, and then I will sum up. So if I could please just ask everybody to put their cameras on. Okay, thank you. I didn't know how long we had to sit like that, but that's thank you for that. So just a question that's come through, from Professor Mike Sachs, which I'd like to address, ask David really to address. What Mike has said is that at some point there's got to be a tipping point when there will be real, you know, issues and disasters. And what is the tipping point, and when do you think that may happen? Could I address David? Could I ask you to answer that accurately?
Thank you
precisely,
very much.
Of course.
Thank you very much. You know, I think that we need to think of perhaps not just one tipping point, but at various types of tipping points regarding the different types of leadership. Let's focus it in on responsible leadership. For instance, the COP26 is coming up. If this conference does not have some semblance of success, it will be a tipping point, I think, a bad tipping point. And reflecting on Michael's presentation about corporate social responsibility, I think too that there also is a looming tipping point. If our business leadership does not understand the need to realign their modus operandi of what it means to be a corporation, then that too will be a tipping point. Because, you know, just listening to that and hearing about the fellow who is very in on the oil and gas industry, yeah, it'll just keep on going. And so there will be a physical tipping point also. And we probably think it's about 2 degrees Celsius global average increase in warming, that too will be a tipping point, a physical tipping point. So perhaps just like Edward introduced the peak chicken, I think we need to maybe think of different types of tipping points. That's a very good question and something to think about more.
There we go. I always forget to unmute. Okay, so thank you very much, David, for that very full answer. I would just like to really tie this up with quite a few things that I'd like to say, because first of all, I would like to thank David for an excellent keynote speech, very, very accessible, very clear, and very worrying in lots of ways, because it was
It's all worried. Yeah.
very, very, very real. I would also like to thank the excellent contributions from the panelists, because lots of key messages were coming out, all said in slightly different ways. The images obviously speak louder than the words, and the actions will speak louder than the meetings. However, you know, we know the science is known. It's up to us as responsible leadership, leaders to act on that, act on our knowledge, and think about what we do. Now, part of that journey has got to be re-looking and re-examining within our own lives, within the places we work, with the influence that we can have, and some of the values that we have, which has led us to where we are. So what do we actually value in society? You know, there are small things, there are bigger things, there are things that we can do. So we have the whole you know, the fast cars as opposed to, you know, electric cars. There are changes that could be made there. Food, making choices about, you know, maybe not eating meat, and certainly not eating chickens, and so on, in the way that we do. You know, having a more sort of healthy vegetarian, vegan diet, and so on. Looking at expensive clothes, all the processes that have to happen to produce those very expensive items, and maybe look at wearing more sustainable clothes, valuing those things as much, traveling, and so on. And the list goes on and on. And really what we're doing is re-looking at the way we've lived our lives for decades, because we've been allowed to live our lives for decades like that. And we are leaving the planet as it is to the next generation and the generations after that. So I think we do have a huge responsibility to readjust and relook at what we do. It clearly is a global issue. We all play a part. We know from what Moako has said, you know, that we're talking about humans having to coexist. We're interdependent. It's the point that Edward brought up. And the survival of the human race is going to depend on addressing some of the issues that Michael Hopkins rose and said, yeah, well, actually, we need to provide ways and find ways to get everybody on board. But a message that came to me as well, loud and clear, was about the importance of the youth and about the importance of representation of a whole variety of groups, because we tend to take our leadership, we tend to take our decision making from established people or people who don't like to rock the boat, and so on. And ironically, I was listening to Bob Geldof's YouTube clip recently, and what he did with Live Aid, what he did for raising that kind of money, what he did for raising that kind of publicity in a way that the establishment just didn't like. You know, he was considered to be brash and so on, but what he was saying was that, yeah, pop music can't really change things, but what we can influence is getting those people together, ready for leaders to make those changes. And I think that in the same way Greta Thunberg has done that, you know, she's turned around and said, you know, all this blah, 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 a bit like we're doing today, although I absolutely believe we are raising the awareness, keeping the agenda going, and that's our role here. You know, she is making people listen, and whether it's popular or unpopular, people are talking about it, people are aware, right to the point where, as I said earlier, you know, we have soap operas writing scripts about climate change, which would not have happened 5 years ago. It just wouldn't have happened. So it's really, really here, and it's really very real. and we all have a huge responsibility. I hope the summit is an excellent one in Glasgow. I hope we have people like David being listened to and influencing, so that we can have some real action to make our world not just a better place, but a survivable place for everybody on this planet. So I would like to say thank you to everybody for your excellent contributions, and a special thank you to Julia for coordinating this and coping with all of the endless emails to make sure that it all actually happens. So Julia does a brilliant job behind the scenes every time. So very big thank you to, and real big thank you to Alex to make these webinars all possible and to be so supportive and encouraging in all of the things we're doing. So thank you, Alex. Okay.
Thank you so very much, dear Julie. And with that, I want to thank everybody on the panel, our participants, for joining us today for this very important and timely event. And I wish you a wonderful evening, and thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.